A dusty typewriter hides a deadly secret and Miss Marple is watching. Welcome to Enigma Beato. I am your host Alexander. I love connecting with you all. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, reading. Your messages makes this channel truly special. Now, let's begin. It was a brilliant June afternoon in the village of St. Mildred's, the kind of day that seemed tailor-made for gossip, bunting, and rhubarb tarts. The sun shone benevolently over the village green, where Miss Emily Hargraves was hosting her annual garden party tradition, as fixed in the social calendar as Harvest Festival or the Vicar's spring sermon on temptation. Beneath a striped marquee, villagers mingled with glasses of elderflower cordial and paper plates sagging under the weight of sponge cakes and cucumber sandwiches. Old Colonel Penrose had already made 3 pointed remarks about the quality of the scones, while the Reverend Phelps made off with his third slice of treacle tart under the pretense of polite sampling. Miss Marple, wearing a pale lavender dress and a modest hat pinned firmly in place, sat quietly on a folding chair under a rose-covered trellis, knitting something indiscernible and occasionally nodding at acquaintances as they passed. She looked, as ever, like someone's slightly bewildered aunt, a harmless soul with a fondness for boiled sweets and dusty novels. No one noticed that she had been watching them all with great attention. The excitement of the afternoon centered around one guest in particular, Mr. Henry Rathbone, the reclusive antiques dealer who had recently purchased the dilapidated Winterfield house. He was tall and gaunt, with a pinched expression and fingers stained with ink. Though known for his valuable restorations, what truly intrigued the villagers was the object he brought to the party, a gleaming black Remington No. 7 typewriter, displayed with near reverence on a small table beside him. "It's Edwardian," he declared, patting the frame as though it were a beloved cat. "Found it in the attic. Still in working order. Imogen. The previous owner used it to draft sermons, or so the solicitor said." Curious guests gathered to inspect it, and young Daisy helped the vicar's niece delighted everyone by typing out her name in clacking keys. It might have ended there, a quaint diversion on a sunny day, had Mrs. Violet Quimby let out a scream 15 minutes later. She had gone into the Hargraves' back parlour to fetch a teacup and returned ashen-faced, her hat askew and gloved hand trembling. "There's a man in there," she gasped, in the study, quite dead. Panic swept through the gathering like wind through barley. Several women clutched at one another. Colonel Penrose barked something about securing the perimeter. Emily Hargraves fainted quietly onto a wicker chair. Within minutes, the study had been cordoned off by makeshift means, a length of bunting and a picnic basket, and the local constable, a flustered young man named Inspector Timothy Gresham, was called in from the cricket pitch. The deceased was quickly identified as Mr. Hugh Everley, a solicitor from neighbouring Barkham and, coincidentally, the man who had handled the sale of Winterfield House. He was slumped over the writing desk, a trickle of blood at his temple, and one hand stretched out toward the antique typewriter, which oddly had been moved from the lawn, and now sat once more inside the room. A sheet of paper was still loaded in its carriage. The last few typed words half finished. "I know what you did. You thought no one." Miss Marple had not screamed, nor had she rushed to the scene. She had simply set down her knitting, stood slowly, and begun to observe. She had already noticed, for example, that Henry Rathbone's hands were trembling, not with grief, but something else, that the vicar's niece, Daisy, had a smudge of typewriter ink on her wrist, that Violet Quimby's scream had been unnaturally shrill for a woman of her temperament, and timed just as the kitchen maid returned from the root cellar. All very interesting, she thought, clasping her hands lightly in front of her. Very interesting. Indeed, the village of St. Mildred's had rarely known such a flurry of excitement. Not even when the bishop's motorcar broke down outside the post office or when Mrs. Pendleton's cat climbed the Vicara chimney and refused to come down. For 3 days, a death job, a murder in the heart of the village, and at Emily Hargrave's garden party of all places was enough to send the entire community into a spin of whispers, clattering teacups, and peering faces behind muslin curtains by early evening. The bunting had been taken down, the marquee collapsed like a wounded beast, and most of the guests had been quietly dismissed. Constable Gresham, red in the face and clearly unaccustomed to such drama, had taken preliminary statements and was now waiting for the county inspector to arrive from Downham. Meanwhile, the body of Mr. Hugh Everley remained undisturbed, locked in the study with a solemn policeman stationed outside the door. Back at the Elms, her vinegar-covered cottage near the churchyard, Miss Marple sat in her usual armchair beside the fire, though the day had not turned cold. A tea tray rested on a low table before her, the pot freshly brewed and a single shortbread biscuit untouched on a saucer. Her knitting remained idle in her lap, the needles still threaded with the pale blue wool of what was likely to become another pair of baby booties. She was not thinking about booties just now, the typewriter. That was peculiar, wasn't it? She had last seen it in the garden under a green and white parasol, admired by at least a dozen villagers, yet there it had been in the study, perched on the desk as though it had never left the house, and that unfinished message she had glimpsed clearly when Constable Gresham unwittingly held the door open too wide. "I know what you did. You thought no one." What an extraordinary thing to be written, threatening, almost melodramatic. But what stood out most to her was the theatricality of it. Mr. Everley, by all accounts, was a cautious man, sober, methodical, disinclined to dramatics, hardly the sort to leave mysterious accusations typed out in such a fashion, especially if he had moments to live, of course. It could have been written after his death. A small knock sounded at the cottage door. She rose slowly and opened it to reveal Miss Caroline Eastley, a rather sharp-nosed woman with an overdeveloped sense of civic duty and an underdeveloped talent for discretion. She was clutching her handbag as though it might flee at any moment, and looked positively bursting with information. "Oh, Miss Marple, I do hope I'm not intruding," she said, already stepping inside. "But I thought you should know well, really. It's all so shocking." Miss Marple ushered her to the settee with a polite smile and poured her a cup of tea. Caroline wasted no time in launching into a detailed, if wildly speculative, account of the day's events. "I always said there was something odd about Mr. Rathbone," she began, stirring her tea despite not having added sugar. "All those crates and deliveries to Winterfield House are the oddest hours. And not just furniture. I'll have you know, I've seen boxes marked fragile and private correspondence, and one I distinctly recall said records." "What kind of records?" "I ask you. I believe antiques sometimes arrive with provenance documents," Miss Marple offered mildly. "Yes, but how many does one man need? And now this murder. Right there in Emily Hargrave's parlour. Such nerve. And what of Mr. Everley?" Miss Marple asked. "Had he enemies?" "Oh, not enemies, exactly. But he did rub people the wrong way. Not the most personable man, very precise. He used to do the accounts for the Young Farmers' Society before they gave him up for being too pedantic, and he once argued with the vicar over church roof repairs." Miss Marple tucked a strand of white hair behind her ear and said nothing. Caroline's voice dropped to a whisper. "Some say it was a quarrel over money. Others say it was something he found in the house. Documents, maybe, or letters. And why else would he be typing a warning before he died? That assumes, of course, that he wrote the message himself." Caroline blinked. "Wellies, I suppose it does. But who else would have?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled just faintly. "Who, indeed?" Caroline left shortly after, clearly pleased to have been consulted, and perhaps believing she had now played her part in solving the case. Miss Marple watched her go, then turned to her fire. Her face thoughtful. The next morning brought more commotion. The Downham inspector, a tall man with a heavy moustache named Inspector Lennox, arrived and immediately assumed control of the investigation. He was the sort of man who liked things neat, preferably with one suspect and one motive. By noon, he had already summoned Henry Rathbone to the Hargraves' parlour for questioning. Miss Marple, under the guise of visiting poor Emily with a pot of gooseberry jam, lingered politely at the edge of the hallway while the door remained slightly ajar. I had nothing to do with it. Rathbone said, his voice hoarse, I didn't even know Mr. Everleigh beyond our brief meetings, yet you brought the typewriter to the party, and it was found beside the victim. Inspector Lennox said, yes, but someone must have moved it. I left it on the lawn, I'm certain of it. Miss Marple could almost hear the inspector's eyebrows raise. And you last saw it there when, just before Mrs. Quimby screamed, I suppose I'd gone to get lemonade and good Lord. Do you think someone's trying to frame me? The inspector made a non-committal sound. Miss Marple tiptoed away. She had heard enough for now. Later that afternoon, the village postmistress, Gwendolen Packer, took it upon herself to provide what she claimed was new evidence. She arrived at the constable's office with a small envelope addressed to Mr. Everleigh in typewritten script. She had not opened it, of course, but she noted that the letter had come through her post just the morning before the murder. And now everyone has theories. It was the Vicar Everleigh threatened to expose church misappropriations. No, it was young Daisy. She's always snooping around Winterfield House. Perhaps he caught her stealing. I tell you, it's Rathbone. Those city types always have secrets. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was not theorizing. She was observing. Quietly, unassumingly, she noticed how Daisy Phelps avoided eye contact when asked about her typing demonstration, how the vicar, normally unflappable, had stumbled in his sermon that Sunday, how Mrs. Quimby now insisted she had seen a shadow behind the curtains before she screamed, though she had said nothing of the sort in her original statement, and most of all, she thought about the typewriter. Not the model or the keys, but the message itself, the phrasing, the pause. You thought no one what? No one saw, no one knew, it was not finished, and that, to Miss Marple, said something rather crucial. Someone had intended to finish it but had been interrupted. Or perhaps someone had wanted it to appear interrupted. There was a world of difference between the two, and in that difference, she suspected, lay the truth. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay a visit to Winterfield House. She had always been rather fond of antiques. The following morning dawned pale and cool, with a lingering mist curling low across the hedgerows and chimney pots of St. Mildred's. The air held the scent of honeysuckle and damp grass. And for all the world it seemed the village was trying to forget that a murder had taken place within its green borders. But beneath the tranquil surface, curiosity and unease simmered just beneath every smile, every good morning, every polite nod passed between neighbours. Miss Marple, wrapped in a dovegrey shawl and with a sturdy walking stick in hand, not for necessity, but rather as a useful prop for appearing frail when one wished to be overlooked, set out from the elms with a quiet purpose. She followed the narrow lane past the post office and the vicarage, past the low stone wall of the churchyard, and then took the gently sloping path toward Winterfield House. The house, as everyone knew, had stood empty for nearly 5 years before Henry Rathbone had purchased it. It was an elegant old Georgian structure, slightly stooped with age, its ivy-covered walls and shuttered windows giving it the melancholy air of a widow in mourning. The locals had speculated endlessly about its contents and his stories of hidden passages, unclaimed fortunes, and a ghost that supposedly paced the east wing on moonless nights, Miss Marple was not given to ghosts. But she did believe that old houses often retained the echoes of human frailty, greed, jealousy, desperation, etched into the very floorboards if one had the patience to listen. She arrived at the Rotieran gate just as Mr. Rathbone emerged from the side garden, a trowel in one gloved hand and a rather startled expression on his face. "Miss Marple," he said, blinking. "I wasn't expecting company. I do hope you'll forgive the intrusion, Mr. Rathbone," she replied gently. "It's just that I've always had a fondness for houses like this. And since you brought such a lovely typewriter to the party, I thought you might indulge an old lady's curiosity about the rest of your collection." He hesitated, glancing back toward the house. "I won't be long," Miss Marple added with a mild smile, "and I have brought these." She held up a small tin of lemon biscuits wrapped in wax paper. "I find antiques and biscuits go very well together." Rathbone gave a short laugh, not entirely convinced, but perhaps grateful for a distraction. "Well, yes, very kind of you. Do come in." She followed him through the gate and up the gravel path to the grand double doors. Inside, the house smelled of furniture polish and damp plaster, with a faint trace of pipe tobacco. The hallway was lined with tall mirrors and faded portraits, and the floorboards creaked with satisfying authenticity. He led her to a drawing room filled with mismatched chairs, oil painting stacked in corners, and a large sideboard bearing to decanters and a collection of crystal tumblers. "I'm still arranging things," he said apologetically. "The study is more organized. That's where I do most of my cataloguing. May I see it?" Miss Marple asked innocently. There was a brief pause, barely noticeable, but not to her. "Yes, of course," he said, setting down the trowel and wiping his hands with a cloth. "Right this way." The study was a smaller room at the rear of the house, with a high window that looked out onto the orchard. Bookshelves lined the walls, many half empty. And in the center stood a broad mahogany desk, its surface neat apart from a lamp, a ledger, and a few envelopes. On a side table to the left rested the Remington No. 7, its glossy black casing still catching the morning light. Miss Marple approached it with interest. "Such craftsmanship," she said, her voice full of admiration. "I do wonder, though, how did it find its way back inside during the party? I distinctly remember seeing it beneath the parasol." Rathbone rubbed the back of his neck. "Yes, that puzzled me too. I hadn't moved it. It must have been brought in by someone else, perhaps one of the guests trying to protect it from, well, nothing really." "The weather was fine. Strange," Miss Marple murmured, leaning slightly to examine the platen. "And such a dramatic message left on it, too." Rathbone shifted uncomfortably. "Yes. Inspector Lennox seems to think it's a clue left by Mr. Everley. But I don't see how. He wasn't in here long enough to type it, was he? Do you often leave your doors unlocked during gatherings?" "Not usually. But it was a garden party, and I had people wandering in and out. I suppose anyone could have slipped in." Miss Marple nodded, seemingly satisfied. Then her eyes drifted to a small waste paper bin beneath the desk. "May I?" "Of course," Rathbone said. Surprised, she bent with deliberate care and retrieved a crumpled sheet of paper. It was blank on one side, but the reverse bore a faint, smeared copy of a typed message not the same as the one found beside the body. She smoothed it gently. "Dearest, I cannot meet you again. It is too dangerous now." Miss Marple glanced at Rathbone, who had gone noticeably pale. "I suppose many people used this machine before the party," she said quietly. "You allowed others to type on it." Yes, of course, Daisy Phelps, for one, and perhaps someone else, beforehand." He looked away, then crossed to the decanter and poured himself a drink, though it was not yet 11. "It means nothing. Old scraps, part of the house's history. There are dozens of those in the attic. Miss Marple did not press further. She thanked him for his time, left the biscuits, and returned to the village deep in thought. That afternoon, a different sort of commotion stirred up outside the post office. Young Tommy Brent, a delivery boy from Barkham, had come racing up the lane shouting about a second letter, this one addressed to Mr. Everley but never collected. It had been misrouted to Barkham's sorting room and only just found. The letter was typed, again on what appeared to be the Remington, but this one read, "Meet me before the garden party, noon. I'll explain everything if you tell anyone. We're both ruined." It was unsigned, Inspector Lennox, having now two messages typed on the same machine, doubled down on his belief that Rathbone was involved. The typewriter was in his possession. The letters originated from it, and the meeting implied a motive. Miss Marple, however, asked a single question softly, almost as an afterthought. What if someone else had access to Winterfield House before the party? No one answered that night. As the village settled into a tense, sleepless quiet, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting needles clicking softly. She thought about the messages, the carefully chosen phrases, the secrecy, and the implication of love has gone sour. She was beginning to see the shape of things, not clearly, not entirely, but enough. It was time, she thought, to speak with Daisy Phelps. She had a feeling the vicar's niece knew far more than she let on. The morning air had a sharper bite the following day, though the skies remained clear and deceptively calm. In the village of St. Mildred's, the rhythm of daily life had begun to resume, but with a distinct stiffness, as though the villagers moved through their routines encased in invisible shells of caution. The murder of Mr. Hugh Everley lingered over teacups and between lines of hymnals, and no one was yet comfortable enough to speak of it with anything more than hushed murmurs. Miss Marple, however, was already several moves ahead of the whispered speculations. After her revealing visit to Winterfield House, her attention had turned squarely to Daisy Phelps. The vicar's niece had always struck her as bright but restless. A girl with too much curiosity and not quite enough restraint. She had seen it many times in the young, especially those brought up under a gentle, moral household like the vicarage. That desire to test the world's edges without truly knowing its dangers. Daisy had been quiet since the party. To quiet, Miss Marple thought. She hadn't joined the ladies' reading circle that met on Wednesdays at the church hall, nor had she been seen at the grocer's, where she typically lingered under the pretext of choosing apples, and perhaps, most telling of all, her Sunday school class had been led by Mrs. Pendleton instead, who, despite her flaudisted spectacles and lack of storytelling skill, had filled in with dutiful cheer. At 10:30, Miss Marple walked the path to the vicarage, admiring the drooping roses and the scent of overgrown lavender curling up from the borders. The door was opened by the vicar himself, Reverend Charles Phelps, a kindly man with a thatch of silver hair and a perpetually harried expression that made him appear as though he were always rushing to outward a forgotten appointment. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed, clearly surprised. "What a pleasure. Do come in, though I fear it's rather chaotic just now. We've got a leak in the scullery and no end of trouble with the cat. I shan't take long," she said with a gentle smile. "I was hoping to speak with Daisy, just a little chat." The vicar hesitated. "She's not quite herself. Very withdrawn since the dreadful business at Miss Hargrave's." "Understandable," said Miss Marple, "a shock to all of us. But sometimes it helps to talk." Reluctantly, the vicar called his niece, and a moment later, Daisy appeared at the foot of the stairs. She looked pale and drawn, her usual sprightly demeanour replaced with caution. Her eyes flickered toward Miss Marple with a trace of apprehension. Miss Marple suggested they take tea in the garden, and soon they were seated beneath the shade of an apple tree, a tray of biscuits and weak tea between them. You were very good with the typewriter, Miss Marple began softly. At the party, such confidence with the keys, I could never manage the rhythm myself. Daisy gave a small, awkward laugh. I used to help father with the parish bulletins. Before the printer came, I practiced on an old one he borrowed from the school. Ah, of course. You know, I've always thought there's something rather elegant about typewritten words. They carry a kind of certainty, don't you think? Daisy said nothing, staring into her cup. You see, Miss Marple continued gently, the odd thing about certainty is that it can also be used to deceive. One reads something typed and assumes it must be true, that the message is genuine. But sometimes those words are only meant to look real. At that, Daisy's hand twitched slightly, and a few drops of tea sloshed into her saucer. I didn't write anything, she said suddenly. He typed my name, that was all, at the party, just for fun. I never said you did, dear. But I wonder if anyone else used the typewriter before the party? Perhaps while it was still at Winterfield. How's Daisy hesitated. I don't know. Are you quite sure? There was a long pause. Then, quietly, almost inaudibly, I saw someone. Miss Marple nodded gently. Would you feel better telling me who? Daisy swallowed. It was late, a week before the party. I went up to the house with a note for Mr. Rathbone. Father's had invited him for supper. The front door was open. I knocked, but no one answered. Then I heard the typing. Just for a moment, I looked through the window, and I saw someone at the desk. Who? Daisy's voice was barely a whisper. Mrs. Quimby. Miss Marple sat back slightly, her knitting bag resting by her side. The revelation was not entirely unexpected. And what was she doing? She was typing something. I couldn't see what, but when she noticed me at the window, she stood up quickly. She looked frightened. Then Mr. Rathbone came into the room and closed the curtains. Did you mention it to anyone? No, I wasn't sure if I was supposed to be there. And she didn't say anything at the party either. Interesting, Miss Marple said, her voice soft. Thank you, my dear, you've been very helpful. As she walked back through the village, Miss Marple allowed her thoughts to turn over slowly, like pages in a well-worn diary. Mrs. Quimby, the very picture of composure and upper-middle-class respectability, had inserted herself into the discovery of the body, her scream marking the precise moment chaos began. Yet now there was reason to believe she had been in that house before unannounced, unnoticed. She thought again of the crumpled letter from the waste-bin at Winterfield House. Dearest R, I cannot meet you again. It is too dangerous now. H was the R for Rathbone, and H for Hugh Everley. Or perhaps the initials had been deliberately chosen to mislead. Later that day, Constable Gresham stopped by the elms with a flustered air. I've been reviewing statements again, Miss Marple, he said, and there's something strange about the Timmings. Mrs. Quimby says she went inside to fetch a teacup from the back parlour at precisely for 15. But Miss Hargrave's cook swears she was in there moments before setting out the lemon tarts, and there was no one in the room then. It was just after 4. No sign of Mr. Everley, so she couldn't have found the body when she said she did, Miss Marple mused. Exactly. Either she got the time wrong or she wasn't the one to discover him. Constable Gresham blinked. You think she might have been involved? Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she stood and fetched a volume from her bookshelf, a small, worn copy of Pride and Prejudice, Human Nature. Constable, she said gently, tapping the cover. Pride, fear, resentment. The seeds of most crimes are sown not with violence, but with bruised feelings and unattended wounds. That evening, the village buzzed anew. Word had spread quietly, as it always did, that Miss Marple had taken an interest in Daisy's account, and that Mrs. Quimby's story was beginning to fray. At the edges, the police re-examined the time of death, the letter found in Barkham, and the position of the typewriter in the study. But Miss Marple was thinking further ahead. She knew this crime was more than a moment of passion. It was a carefully staged scene, a performance. Someone had written not just a message but a script, and she was beginning to sense who the playwright might be. Next, she would speak with Mrs. Quimby, not about murder, not directly, but about the one thing every woman in St. Mildred's feared most, reputation. Mrs. Violet Quimby lived on the edge of St. Mildred's, in a square-fronted cottage, trimmed with white latticework and a front garden as obsessively pruned as the woman herself. The roses stood in strict formation, not a petal out of place, and the stone path was swept with such devotion one might imagine it offended her personally if a leaf dared to fall across it, inside. The parlour was as immaculate as the garden. China figurines on glass shelves, polished silver teapots, and doilies so stiff they seemed starched into defiance. It was not a house that welcomed spontaneity. It was a house that whispered of control. Miss Marple arrived promptly at 3 o'clock, bearing a jar of her blackcurrant preserves. How very kind. Mrs. Quimby said, her smile as tight as her chignon. Do sit down. I've just brewed a fresh pot. They settled opposite one another on delicately upholstered chairs. Through the open window came the scent of roses and the distant hum of a lawnmower. For a moment, the illusion of village serenity returned, porcelain teacups clinking, a lace tablecloth beneath a plate of almond biscuits, to respectable women engaged in idle conversation. But Miss Marple was not here for idle talk. I've always admired your garden, Mrs. Quimby, she began mildly. You must have a keen eye for detail. One must, in this climate. Things grow so fast if one doesn't keep them in check, weeds in particular. Quite right, Miss Marple said, though it seems to me people are rather like that. If left unattended, their resentments tend to take root, often in the most surprising places. Mrs. Quimby's expression didn't flicker. She reached for her teaspoon and stirred her tea with deliberate composure. Are you speaking of someone in particular, Miss Marple? Only in general, she said lightly. But it has been on my mind, especially since poor Mr. Everleigh's death. Such a terrible business. I suppose we shall never quite know what happened. At this, the faintest twitch crossed Mrs. Quimby's lips, the kind of almost smile one gives when a lie is successfully maintained, if only just. Oh, I imagine the police will sort it out. Inspector Lennox seems very capable. Yes, but capable men often see only what they expect to see. A neat answer, a likely suspect. They rarely consider layers. Mrs. Quimby sipped her tea. Surely you aren't suggesting there are layers in this case. I find there usually are, Miss Marple said, eyes serene. Take the matter of the typewriter. Most believe it to be a passive object vessel. But what if it was something more? Mrs. Quimby looked up sharply. More, Miss Marple nodded. An instrument, not just for writing, but for misleading. There are letters, you know, typed. One found in Mr. Everleigh's effects, another delivered. Just yesterday, urging him to meet someone secretly before the garden party. Anonymous, of course, that doesn't surprise me, Mrs. Quimby replied, tone brisk. The man was secretive, self-important, always sniffing into people's affairs. I told Emily as much. You knew him well. Then, I knew enough, she said, then. Caught herself, I mean no more than anyone. He was a solicitor. Our paths crossed now and then. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her expression remained mild. And yet I understand you were seen at Winterfield House the week before the party. The air in the room tightened. A single rose petal drifted in through the window and landed on the tablecloth. I don't know what you mean. Daisy Phelps happened to call that day. She saw someone typing. She believes it was you. Mrs. Quimby's hand hovered over her teacup. Her voice dropped, laced now with steel. That girl is mistaken. It was a brief visit. I dropped off a parcel for the Historical Society. Mr. Rathbone is a member. I was in and out within minutes. Miss Marple's voice lowered gently. Forgive me, Mrs. Quimby, but your visit was longer than that, and you were seen through the window. I believe you were typing. Mrs. Quimby sat very still. Her posture, though still upright, had lost some of its earlier poise. I was doing nothing improper, she said finally. If you must know, Mr. Rathbone allowed me to try the machine. I used to do secretarial work in my youth, before I married. The rhythm of it I found oddly comforting. I quite understand, Miss Marple said kindly. But I wonder, did Mr. Everleigh know about your visit? Silence, then the faintest, almost imperceptible nod. Yes, Mrs. Quimby said, her voice a whisper now. He saw me leaving. I didn't realize he was nearby. The next day, he sent a note, said he wanted to speak privately. About what? She looked down into her lap, where her hands were clenched tightly together. I suppose he thought it looked suspicious, that I was forging something, which I was not, of course. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice almost conspiratorial. May I ask what you were typing? Mrs. Quimby's eyes darted toward the window. It was a letter to someone who had disappointed me. Nothing criminal, nothing improper. But I wanted to say my piece. I thought perhaps if it were anonymous, it would be taken more seriously. It was foolish, not necessarily, but it does present a problem, doesn't it, when something typed anonymously becomes entangled in a murder. A long pause passed. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily. At last, Mrs. Quimby let out a sigh, heavy and deflating. I never meant harm, Miss Marple, truly. But Mr. Everleigh hinted that he might bring up this supposed impropriety of mine. I was terrified. My late husband's name, our position in the village reputation. Miss Marple said gently, it can be both shield and shackle. Mrs. Quimby nodded, her eyes rimmed with sudden tears. But I didn't kill him, I swear to you, I did not write those messages, and I did not move the typewriter. Miss Marple sat back, folding her hands. Then who did? Mrs. Quimby shook her head slowly. I don't know, but someone wanted him silenced, and I think I was meant to find the body, or be seen doing so. It was all so perfectly staged, too perfect. Later, as Miss Marple walked back through the village, the first drops of rain began to fall. The air had shifted. The storm long promised by the warm, unsettled days was finally arriving. She drew her shawl closer, her thoughts already forming into patterns. Mrs. Quimby had not killed Hugh Everleigh, of that she was nearly certain, but the woman had been used, guided into place like a piece on a chessboard. A scream to distract, a discovery to mislead. The killer, Miss Marple now believed, was someone far more calculating, someone who understood the art of misdirection, someone who knew that guilt in a village like St. Mildred's didn't require proof, only suggestion, and someone who, she was now certain, had written more than just the message found beside the body. They had written the entire scene. Next, she would speak to the one person who always seemed to be nearby, yet rarely spoken to. The maid from the Hargraves household. She had returned from the root cellar just moments before the scream, and Miss Marple had learned long ago servants saw everything by the following morning. St. Mildred's was draped in a soft, persistent drizzle that clung to hedgerows and windows alike. The clouds hung low over the rooftops, and the usual chirrup of sparrows was replaced by the rhythmic tapping of rain on slate. But if the weather suggested gloom, Miss Marple's steps remained brisk and deliberate. She had made her inquiries, followed the threads through letters and whispered conversations, and now only one piece of the puzzle remained hidden behind silence. The maid, her name was Ivy Cooper. A local girl of 19, and like many in her position, she had perfected the art of appearing invisible. Ivy had worked for Miss Emily Hargraves since Easter and was known for her quiet demeanour, quick hands, and an unerring ability to disappear just as someone turned to speak to her. But Miss Marple, who had watched Ivy move about during the garden party, had seen more than most. It was Ivy who had gone to the root cellar not long before Mrs. Quimby's scream. Ivy who had returned with a tray of preserves and found the atmosphere suddenly charged. And it was Ivy who had lingered in the hallway after the study had been closed off, eyes wide and frightened, but lips tightly sealed. Miss Marple's knock at the Hargraves' back door was answered by the maid herself. Her dark hair tucked beneath a kerchief and her sleeves dusted with flour. "Morning, miss," she said, surprised but polite. "Miss Hargraves is out, visiting her sister in Little Darling Sham. It's you I came to see," Miss Marple replied. Stepping under the narrow porch to avoid the rain, "May I?" Ivy looked hesitant but stepped aside, and soon they were settled in the warmth of the kitchen, where a kettle sang quietly and the smell of baking filled the air. "Ivy," Miss Marple began, wrapping her hands around the teacup Ivy had shyly placed before her. "You were in the cellar just before everything happened at the party, weren't you?" Ivy's eyes flickered. "Yes, miss. Miss Hargraves sent me down for more chutney. She thought the cheese table looked bare, and when you came back up, I heard a fuss, then Mrs. Quimby screamed. People running." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "But the study was closed off by then, wasn't it?" Ivy looked down at her apron. "Yes, miss, the constable said not to go near, and yet you seemed troubled. I saw it in your face, my dear, not just frightened by the scream. More than that, you'd seen something, hadn't you?" Ivy bit her lip. "I'm not supposed to gossip," she said in a small voice. "This isn't gossip," Miss Marple replied gently. "This is justice. Mr. Everleigh is dead, and I believe someone wanted you to miss what was happening. Someone who knew the root cellar was far enough that you wouldn't hear until it was too late." Ivy was silent for a moment. Then, in a hesitant voice, she said, "There was someone upstairs. When I came back up, I only just caught a glimpse through the crack in the drawing-room door. They were leaving the study in a hurry." Miss Marple's heart gave a small flutter. She kept her tone even. "Who?" Couldn't see clearly, just a shape, but it wasn't Mrs. Quimby, tall. They had something in their hand, a piece of paper. Miss Marple leaned in ever so slightly. "Did they go out the front?" "No, miss, out the side door." Through the corridor by the library, Miss Marple filed this away. The side corridor connected directly to the garden, near the hedge where the typewriter had first been displayed. That meant the machine could have been moved without anyone noticing, placed in the study as part of the scene, as part of the performance. She sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Tell me, Ivy, did you hear any voices that day, arguing, perhaps before you went downstairs?" The maid hesitated again. "Yes, just for a moment, to men, in the hallway. One of them sounded angry. The other is calm, but cold." "Did you recognize either of them?" "I think one was Mr. Everleigh. The other I don't know, but it wasn't Mr. Rathbone. His voice is deeper." Miss Marple's mind turned. If it wasn't Rathbone, and it wasn't Everleigh arguing with the antiques dealer, then who? Then something else occurred to her. "Did anyone else ask you to go to the cellar?" "Ivy." The girl blinked. "No, Miss Hargraves sent me." But she hesitated. "Just before that, someone told me they'd spilled something on the garden steps, asked me to bring a cloth, said they'd wait. But when I came back, no one was there. That's when Miss Hargraves asked for the chutney." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Who asked you for the cloth?" "I'm not sure. I thought it was the vicar's niece, Miss Daisy, but now I'm not so certain." She had a scarf over her head, and her voice was strange, tight, like she didn't want to be recognized. Miss Marple sat back, silent for a long moment. The pieces were now slightly scattered, but beginning to form a shape. Someone had deliberately sent Ivy out of the way. Someone had wanted her not To witness a brief, critical window of time, not to see the room, not to hear the argument, not to note the placement of the typewriter, she stood and gave Ivy's arm a warm pat. "You've been most helpful. Dear, I shan't trouble you further. But to be cautious whom you trust to send you on errands, won't you?" Ivy nodded, her face pale but grateful. "Yes, Miss Marple," returned to the elms beneath the dripping trees, her thoughts sharper than ever. The threads were tightening. The lies, though carefully arranged, were beginning to curl at the edges. And now she was certain of 3 things. First, Hugh Everley had not been killed in a moment of fury or impulse. It had been planned. Second, the scene in the study had stage-typed messages. A dramatic death pose, a misleading trail of suspicion. And third, the person who had crafted the narrative had made one critical mistake. They believed no one would see through the drama, but Miss Marple was not one to be distracted by theatrics. By early evening, she sat by the hearth knitting. Once more. A soft rap came at the door just before sunset. It was Inspector Lennox. "I've been told you spoke with the maid," he said. "I did," she replied, "and I believe I may have something to tell you." His brow furrowed. "You're close to something, aren't you?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet certainty. "I am," she said, gently laying her knitting in her lap. "But before I explain, I need to ask you one thing." "What's that?" "Do you recall who first suggested that the message on the typewriter was written by Mr. Everley?" Lennox blinked. "Well, it was Mrs. Quimby, I believe. She found the body." "Ah," Miss Marple said, "but she didn't see him type it, did she?" She only assumed, or perhaps she repeated what someone else told her to say. The inspector stared at her. "You think someone coached her?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think someone composed this entire tragedy like a piece of fiction. Now all that remains is to read the final page, the next day." She would do precisely that, and this time she would not ask questions. She would watch someone very carefully. Because a truth, she knew, often revealed itself not in what a person said, but in how they listened. It was the first truly clear day since the murder. The rain had passed in the night, leaving the village of St. Mildred's washed and glistening, the leaves on the trees heavy with droplets, and the cobbled lanes soft with light. Birds sang again, and the clouds, once thick and oppressive, had broken apart, like old secrets reluctantly yielding to the sun. Miss Marple sat in her small parlour with her morning tea. Knitting abandoned on the table beside her, the fire was low now, barely glowing, and the house was quiet apart from the ticking of the Lonquet's clock in the corner. She had been thinking. She had, in fact, done very little else for the past week. Thinking, listening, observing. Now the pattern was nearly complete, but there remained one final test. Not facts, those she had gathered. What she needed now was something subtler. A crack in the performance, a hesitation, a glimpse beneath the mask. For that, she would need to set a stage of her own. By noon, Miss Marple had made her way to the village green where, by quiet arrangement, a gathering had been called under the guise of offering communal support, the Excusian informal. Remembrance for Hugh Everley was just enough to summon the principal figures of the mystery without raising alarm. Emily Hargraves, still pale and shaken, arrived first, with a silver brooch pinned to her collar and a dazed look that had not left her since the day her parlour became a crime scene. Mrs. Quimby followed, composed as always but with a tension about the mouth that Miss Marple recognised as the effort of holding something back. Reverend Phelps, tall and hesitant, brought his niece Daisy, who clung to his side as though seeking invisibility. Henry Rathbone came last, dressed in dark tweed, his hands in his coat pockets and his brow furrowed. Miss Marple greeted each of them with warmth and customary politeness, then guided them toward the garden behind the vicarage, where chairs had been arranged in a modest circle beneath the trees. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice calm and clear. "I believe it's important that we, as a village, acknowledge what has happened. Mr. Everleigh's death has touched all of us. And before matters are concluded by the authorities, I thought it might be fitting to share any memories or thoughts, or if I may have such bold concerns that still trouble us." The group murmured polite agreement. No one, however, looked entirely at ease. Miss Marple continued, her voice taking on a lighter, musing tone. "It struck me, you see, how strange it is that the typewriter, such a charming object, a piece of craftsmanship, could become the centerpiece of something so grim. I imagine it was never intended for such drama." A pause. Daisy shifted slightly in her seat. "Still, I find it fascinating how easily words, typed or otherwise, can mislead. How they can take on meaning simply because we believe they were written at a particular time by a particular hand." Mrs. Quimby stiffened. Henry Rathbone glanced away. "Take, for instance, the note found in Mr. Everleigh's hand, half-dipped on the machine. I know what you did. You thought no one a rather dramatic declaration, don't you think? Very much the sort of thing one would expect in a detective novel." The group was silent. Miss Marple looked up gently. "Does anyone here believe he actually wrote it himself?" Emily Hargraves blinked. "But wasn't it left by him?" Miss Marple smiled. "Or by someone who wanted us to think he had left it, a difference. That changes everything. After all, we must ask, when exactly did Mr. Everleigh die? Before the message was typed, or after?" The silence deepened. Ivy Cooper, Miss Hargrave's maid, saw someone leave the study before the body was found, and she was sent away from the house deliberately. I believe she wouldn't witness something. A small misdirection, but an effective one. And then there's the letter sent to Mr. Everleigh, an anonymous note urging him to meet before the party. Again, typed, but not signed. Miss Marple turned her eyes, clear and unflinching, toward Henry Rathbone. "Mr. Rathbone, you say you did not write that letter, that you never invited Mr. Everleigh to the house before the garden party?" Rathbone cleared his throat. "No, I did not. I found him to be a tiresome man. His visit to Winterfield House was unannounced. I was surprised, too. See him, and you never asked Mrs. Quimby to type anything for you?" Rathbone looked startled. "No, certainly not." Miss Marple turned, then to Mrs. Quimby. "You were seen typing in Winterfield House by Daisy. You said it was a personal letter, but you admitted to being fearful of Mr. Everleigh's reaction. Why?" Mrs. Quimby's hands were clasped tightly in her lap. "He threatened to misinterpret my actions, to humiliate me. I was foolish, but I did not kill him." "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "I don't believe you did." She then looked at Daisy Phelps. "Daisy, my dear, you were so eager to try the typewriter, and you knew it well, from helping your uncle with the parish bulletins. But when I asked Ivy, who had sent her to fetch a clothes-me-own who then disappeared, she thought it was you. Do you remember?" Daisy's face turned white. "I know. I never, but Ivy said something important. The person had their head covered, and their voices sounded disguised." Miss Marple turned at last to the Reverend. Her voice softened. "Reverend Phelps, your niece may not have sent Ivy away, but you did, didn't you?" The vicar stared at her. "Why on earth would I protect her, Miss Marple said. "But not because she was guilty, because you were." The garden went still. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. "You were seen, not clearly, not fully, but Ivy saw a man. Angry, cold, that was the voice she heard. In the hallway with Mr. Everleigh, and you, sir, were the only one nearby with causal cause to fear what Mr. Everleigh knew." Reverend Phelps did not answer. His hands had gone still. "You knew about the letters. You knew Daisy had been meeting someone perhaps only once, perhaps just in letters. But it was enough to make you afraid, and when Mr. Everleigh learned of it, and threatened to expose it, perhaps even suggesting she had been manipulated. You feared a scandal that would ruin you both. Still, the vicar said nothing. So you invited Mr. Everleigh to Winterfield House using the typewriter. You copied the format from an earlier message. You planned it carefully. You staged the scene while everyone was in the garden, and when the time came, you removed the typewriter, returned it to the study, and placed a false message to frame someone else. Now Miss Marple stood. But what you did not count on, Reverend, was that Ivy would return early, that she would see you leave. Nor did you expect Mrs. Quimby's scream came at quite the wrong moment when she found the room not empty, but staged. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant trill of a bird. Then Reverend Phelps exhaled a long, slow breath. His voice, when it came, was quiet. He said terrible things about her, about me, about what people would think. I couldn't allow it. Daisy's eyes filled with tears. Uncle Miss Marple turned gently to her. He did it to protect you. But the truth, as always, finds its way to the surface. She turned then to Inspector Lennox, who had arrived just as the vicar fell silent, summoned quietly by Miss Marple as before. "It's done," she said. He nodded solemnly and stepped forward. As Reverend Phelps stood, Miss Marple closed her eyes for a brief moment. She felt no triumph, only a quiet, familiar ache. In every village, she had once said, there are secrets in plain sight, and when those secrets are exposed, they never leave things quite the same. The shock of Reverend Phelps's quiet confession echoed through St. Mildred's like the toll of a distant bell. Muffled by propriety, softened by disbelief, but unmistakably real. By evening, the village had fallen into an uneasy hush, as though the hedgerows themselves whispered the news from cottage to cottage. No one quite knew what to say. The idea that the vicar, a man who had led harvest prayers, presided over christenings and funerals, and spoke gently at the bedside of the ill could be guilty of murder was not something easily digested over supper, yet here it was, laid bare by Miss Marple's calm observations and Reverend Phelps's own bowed head. At the elms, the kettle sang softly as Miss Marple sat once again in her armchair, her knitting resting untouched in her lap. She had not moved for some time, lost in thought. Not out of doubt, but reflection. She was thinking not of guilt and innocence, but of burdens of the quiet, weighty things people carried inside them, often for years. She had long believed that the worst crimes did not grow from madness or wild passion, but from pain that had been allowed to fester unspoken. And this, she thought, had been just such a case. The next morning, Inspector Lennox stopped by. He stood awkwardly on her doorstep, his coat damp with mist, and his hat clasped in both hands like a schoolboy awaiting judgment. "I don't suppose I've thanked you properly, Miss Marple," he said, "though I doubt anything I say will be adequate." She ushered him in with a small smile and poured him tea. "I merely observed, Inspector," she said, as any sensible old woman would. "You see, I've long found that people reveal more in what they don't say than in what they do." Lennox sipped quietly. "I've seen clever murderers before," he said after a moment, but this was different. He was trying to protect her. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "But protection becomes dangerous when it's confused with control, Reverend." Phelps feared a scandal. Yes, but more than that, he feared losing authority. He couldn't bear the idea of losing his place, his reputation, and so he acted. The inspector nodded. "We found a copy of the anonymous letter in his desk drawer. Typed but never posted. He was practicing, I think, making sure the phrasing was just right." Miss Marple's brow lifted slightly. "Then he intended from the beginning to lure Mr. Everleigh to Winterfield House." "Yes, and the typewriter being on display at the party gave him a perfect opportunity to build a story." Move it at the right time, set the stage, point suspicion elsewhere, and Mrs. Quimby, Miss Marple added thoughtfully, was always a convenient red herring. She had her own secrets, after all, and secrets make excellent distractions. Lennox leaned back with a sigh. She's still furious with me, he said. Claims she was nearly destroyed by suspicion. Miss Marple chuckled. Perhaps a touch of humility will do her some good. Though I imagine she'll find a way to work this entire affair into her next historical society. Address, he smiled, and the niece, Daisy. Miss Marple's expression softened. She'll need time, she's young, but she's strong, and she'll grow wiser for it. If anything, the tragedy may have freed her from judgment, from secrets, even from her uncle's overbearing shadow. They sat for a moment in companionable silence. Do you ever find it hard? Lennox asked quietly, knowing what people are capable of. Miss Marple looked into her teacup, watching the surface tremble gently with the fire's warmth. Sometimes, she said, but more often, I find comfort in knowing that people can surprise us for the better too, even those who make grave mistakes are still, at heart, human. I've known selfish men to turn generous, cowards to become brave, liars to find honesty. It isn't the sin that defines us, Inspector. It's what we do once we see it for what it is. He left shortly after, and Miss Marple returned to her window seat, gazing out at the garden where the first hints of autumn had begun to curl the edges of the leaves across the lane. She spotted Daisy walking slowly along the path by the churchyard, her shoulders no longer hunched in shame. She paused to speak to Mrs. Pendleton, who gave her a pat on the hand and offered a tart from her basket. Life, Miss Marple thought, had a curious way of writing itself. Later that afternoon, she received a letter. The envelope was simple and unmarked, the handwriting tight and careful. Inside was a single sheet of notepaper and a pressed violet. Dear Miss Marple, it read. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't seen through it all. I can't explain how strange it is to feel both sorrow and freedom at once. I loved my uncle, but I lived under his rules. I don't know what comes next, but I'm grateful to you for giving me the chance to find out. Yours sincerely, Daisy. Miss Marple closed the letter gently and tucked it into a small wooden box on her writing desk, where she kept things of quiet importance, cephalopods, pressed flowers, and notes that reminded her of lives touched, mended, or quietly observed. By evening, the village had begun to return to its rhythms. At the post office, Gwendolen Packer was seen gossiping less and sorting more. Colonel Penrose took his usual turn around the green, his barks about scones now replaced by mutterings about wet weather. Even Mrs. Quimby resumed her brisk walks to the grocer's, her hat pinned higher than ever, as though daring anyone to question her place in the world. Only Winterfield House remained quiet, its windows, once filled with light, and guests, were now dark again. Henry Rathbone had left quietly the day after the arrest, his belongings packed without fuss. Rumour had it he was returning to London, though a few villagers speculated he might settle in Devon or even abroad. Miss Marple doubted he would stay away forever. Some men preferred the company of old objects over unpredictable people, but even the loneliest antiques dealer sometimes found he needed a cup of tea and a conversation with someone who understood regret. As for the Remington typewriter, it was returned to its case, its keys wiped clean, its ribbon carefully replaced. Miss Marple examined it one last time before giving it back to Rathbone. Strange, isn't it? She said aloud, as she tested the keys. How something meant to preserve thoughts can also be used to hide them. She typed a single line before closing the lid. Truth, once written, finds a way to speak. She smiled to herself. The machine, like the village, would carry on its past etched quietly into its frame, its future uncertain, but full of possibility. Miss Marple folded her shawl more tightly around her shoulders and turned back to her fire. Outside, the sun dipped, lower, casting gold across the hedgerows, and in St. Mildred's, peaceful, imperfect, but genuine settled once more, the days following the quiet rest of Reverend Phelps unfolded slowly. Like pages of a novel being carefully turned in the hands of a thoughtful reader, St. Mildred's returned, in part, to its domestic rhythms. Yet the air was different, no lighter in some places, heavier in others. Conversations remained cautious, and laughter, when it came, had a slightly forced edge to it. As if people still feared they might be overheard by secrets not yet laid to rest, Miss Marple continued her routines with the same outward serenity. Each morning she fetched her milk from the gate, collected her post with a nod to Gwendolen Packer, and exchanged small pleasantries with neighbours who were now more inclined to study her face for traces of insight, wondering what she might know about them. They never asked directly, of course that would have been vulgar, but the question lingered, polite and unspoken, at the vicarage. Daisy Phelps had not fled the village as some feared or hoped might. On the contrary, she remained. Quieter perhaps, but composed. She had taken over the domestic management of the vicarage in her uncle's absence, cleaning the study and arranging his books without fanfare or outward emotion. And though the bishop had assigned a temporary cleric from Downham to tend to the parish duties, Daisy still arrived at the church on Sunday mornings, sitting in the third pew from the front. Her head held a little higher than before. There was a dignity to it, Miss Marple thought, grief-worn without spectacle, but not everyone approved. Do you suppose she knew what he'd done? Mrs. Pendleton had asked during a recent tea at the Women's Guild. Her voice pitched just low enough to carry only to the neighbouring table, and just high enough to make certain it would be overheard. Miss Marple had merely stirred her tea. Knowing and understanding are not always the same thing, she replied, not unkindly, and it was true, as the days passed. There were still fragments of the mystery left to settle, not in the courtroom, but in the hearts and minds of those who had been caught in its web. There was, for instance, Emily Hargraves. On the surface, she had returned to form, once again fussing over flower arrangements and resuming her role as hostess for the Thursday literary circle. But those who knew her well noted that she now avoided her own parlour with subtle determination. When visitors came, they were directed to the drawing-room or the conservatory. The scene of the murder, though scrubbed and polished, seemed to hum with memory, as though the walls remembered what the people tried to forget. Miss Marple, sensing this quiet disquiet, paid a visit one breezy afternoon. Carrying a basket of lemon verbena cut from her own garden, Emily greeted her with nervous cheer. "How good of you to come," she said. "Do forgive the state of things, we've been in a bit of a muddle." Miss Marple stepped inside, her sharp blue eyes glancing around the entryway with soft purpose. Muddles are often a sign that something needs to be put back in its proper place, she replied gently. They sat in the conservatory, where the sun warmed the flagstone floor and the scent of mint drifted from the window boxes. "I still can't quite believe it," Emily confessed, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Charles, of all people. I've known him for 30 years. He baptized both of my godsons. I once saw him sit beside a dying woman for hours without stirring." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Men are rarely only what they appear to be," she said. "That does not make them wicked, necessarily, but it does make them human. I suppose that's what frightens me most," Emily said, her eyes glistening. "If he was capable of such a thing, then who else? What else am I missing in the people, I think? I know." Miss Marple reached across the table and gave her hand a soft pat. "We can never know everything, dear, but we can watch, we can listen. And when the time comes, we can choose to not. Emily nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. I suppose that's what you did. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not at all. I merely paid attention. The rest, as ever, revealed itself that evening, back at the Elms, Miss Marple lit a small lamp by her writing desk and opened her diary. She wrote without hurry, pausing occasionally to reflect, then continued. It was not a journal in the ordinary sense, no dramatic accounts or emotional outpourings, but rather a quiet cataloguing of events, behaviours, and human truths. Murder, she wrote, does not arrive with thunder and lightning. It slips in under doorways, concealed in gestures, half-finished sentences, and unexplained silences. In the end, it is always about something small, a fear, pride, a longing. She paused, then added a final note. The truth, when it finally comes, is rarely as loud as the lie, but it is infinitely more lasting. The next morning brought a small, unexpected visitor, Daisy. She stood on Miss Marple's front step with a parcel wrapped in brown paper and a hesitant smile. I wanted to thank you, she said. And to ask you something. Miss Marple invited her in, and they sat together by the hearth. I found this, Daisy said, unwrapping the parcel to reveal a bundle of letters. In a drawer at the vicarage. Not from Uncle, from my mother. I never knew her properly. She died when I was very young. But these are her words. Miss Marple touched the bundle gently. Then I imagine you're just beginning to know her. Daisy looked down. I thought everything I was came from my uncle, his beliefs, his judgment, his way of seeing the world. But now reading these, I realize I might be different. That I might have a mind of my own. Miss Marple's smile deepened. That, my dear, is a gift, though not without cost. I know, Daisy said, but I want to understand people better. Like you do. Miss Marple laughed softly. It's not difficult. Simply pay attention. People tell you who they are. Whether they mean to or not, you only have to listen without trying to correct them. Daisy nodded slowly. I think I will. As the girl left, Miss Marple watched her walk down the lane, taller somehow, more centred. Not just freed from her uncle's shadow, but stepping into something larger, her own life. The village clock struck 4, birds fluttered in the hedgerows, and somewhere a window creaked open to catch the last warmth of the sun inside. Miss Marple reached once more for her knitting. The blue yarn, soft and steady in her lap, began to form another shape, something quiet, something whole. Outside, the world continued to turn, and in the hush that followed a storm, all things once shaken began to settle. Summer had begun its gentle retreat from St. Mildred's. The trees still wore green, but a few leaves had taken on the faintest blush of gold, and the breeze that rustled through the hedges no longer felt idlite, had the intent of coming. Chained gardens, once bursting, now sagged slightly at the edges, like ladies in grand hats after a long afternoon of tea. The bees worked a little slower. The light fell at a gentler angle. And in the elms, Miss Marple sipped her evening tea with the unspoken satisfaction of someone who had once again borne witness to the truth, however uncomfortable it might have been. There was something sacred about the stillness after a storm. The case of Mr. Everleigh's murder had concluded swiftly once Reverend Phelps's confession was placed before the Crown. His solicitor, a dry, pinched man from Eastbourne, entered a plea that suggested a tragic loss of judgment rather than a deliberate plot. The newspapers, sniffing for scandal, printed little more than a few paragraphs. Country clergyman held in quiet murder. It was not sensational enough to linger on city shelves, but in St. Mildred's, the echo remained. The church bells still rang on Sundays, though for the time being they were rung by the curate from Downham, whose sermons lacked the familiar cadence but were earnest enough to satisfy the older ladies in the front pews. Mrs. Quimby resumed her meetings with the Historical Society, holding court at the back of the village library with her usual clipped diction and occasional References to unpleasantness never named. Miss Hargraves finally began to use her parlour again, and Daisy Phelps, perhaps the most changed of all, took up volunteer work at the village school. Her eyes no longer darted when spoken to, and her voice carried more certainty with each passing week. It was one of those late summer mornings when dew still clung to the roses and the post hadn't yet arrived that Miss Marple decided to take one last walk to Winterfield House. She hadn't seen Mr. Rathbone since he left quietly in the days. Following the arrest, there had been no farewell, no note of thanks, no grand gesture, just a locked door, shuttered windows, and a delivery cart that came and went one damp Thursday morning. But now, as she passed the rusted gate, she saw the sign had been removed. The weeds had been clipped back, the brass door knocker gleamed, recently polished. She let herself in through the gate and walked the familiar path to the doorstep, where a faint smell of paint and varnish lingered in the air. Before she could knock, the door opened. "Miss Marple," said Henry Rathbone, looking rather as he always had, tired around the eyes, collar slightly askew, and a faint air of mischief behind his reserve. "I was just about to send it to you." She smiled warmly. "Were you? I owe you an apology," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "And I suppose, my thanks." She entered the hallway, pausing to glance at the portraits lining the walls. They were hung straighter now, and there was a vase of wild flowers on the console. "I take it you're staying?" she asked. "For now," he said. "There's a quiet here I didn't appreciate before, and I've taken a few commissions for restoration. Nothing grand, but enough to keep the lights on." They entered the study, where the Remington typewriter sat once more on its table, this time next to a small stack of parchment and a half-written letter. "She's in perfect working order again," he said, patting the machine affectionately, "replaced the ribbon, cleaned the hammers, thought I might write something honest for a change." Miss Marple lowered herself into a chair near the window. "Truth is always a good starting point," she said. He leaned against the desk. "I've thought a lot about what happened, about the typewriter, about how it became a tool in a story none of us could have written. It was never about the typewriter," Miss Marple said gently. "It was about fear, of losing control, of being misunderstood, of scandal." Reverend Phelps tried to script a version of events that kept his world from crumbling, but he forgot the most important truth of all. Rathbone raised an eyebrow. "Are those lies poor architects, that human nature, in all its frailty and goodness, refuses to be written to order?" She said, "You can't hide the truth in neatly typed lines. Sooner or later, it rises." They sat for a while in companionable silence. "I suppose the village won't quite look at me the same," Rathbone said eventually. Miss Marple gave a light shrug. "They'll find something new to gossip about. A cat stuck in a chimney, perhaps, or Mrs. Pendleton's recipe for upside-down sponge failing again. You'll fade from the centre of the tale soon enough." He looked relieved. "And you?" "Oh, I'm always on the edge of things," she said with a smile. "Where the view is clearer, that afternoon." Miss Marple returned to the Elms, where she wrote to letters and folded away a lace tablecloth she had decided she no longer needed. It was a day for small decisions, she felt, the kind that quietly moves one chapter into the next. By supper, the skies had turned soft and peach-coloured, the sun dipping low beyond the distant trees. She set her plate by the window and watched the shadows stretch across the garden. And she reflected, as she often did at such moments, that evil, when it appeared, rarely did so in the form of monsters. It crept in through the wounded hearts of good people, through fear, pride, and silence, but the light always returned, eventually. It might arrive through the courage of a young woman stepping into her own life, or in the renewed rhythm of an old machine, restored not just in function, but in meaning, or even in the quiet observations of a lady with a teapot and a curious mind. As the first star blinked in the evening sky, Miss Marple set down her fork and folded her hands. Tomorrow, she might begin a new blanket for the twins at the vicarage. Or perhaps she would reread a favourite novel. There would always be another mystery to untangle, another human truth to uncover. But for tonight, she was content to sit in the golden hush, watching the village she loved begin again, and somewhere in the background, almost imperceptibly, the Remington typewriter waited, silent for now, but ready for the next story, whatever it might be.